This is a very early Bassmaster. It's one of the first ones with a solid state rectifier. It's very interesting because it follows the Marshall and early Fender Bassman circuit very closely. If you look at the typical Fender Bassman layout for the 59 Bassman, you see that they are actually very similar. And if you make a part-by-part comparison, you also see that they're almost identical. The notable exceptions being a couple of things. The schematic, the typical Fender schematic that you see, 5F6A, is the one that Marshall copied, and this amp, I suspect, was lifted more directly from a 59 Bassman. The big difference between the earlier and the later Bassmans is the tone stack, which is right here. In the Marshall, you have two 02 coupling caps for the mids and the bass. In the late 59 Bassman and the later super reverbs and so on, you had an 02 for the mids and a 0.1 cap, which is much larger, for the bass. So this amp looks like when Pete Traynor was designing the amp, he was looking at the 59 Bassman. And of course we know that because there are stories of Pete Traynor playing in a band with Robbie Robertson, and both of them having 59 Bassmans to play through. So that would have been the origin of their liking of this circuit. The other notable change compared to the Tweed Bassman, most of this stuff is almost identical. These are the mixer resistors. They bring the returns from the two channel volume controls and mix them back to a single point, so they move on to the next stage. And in the early Bassman, these were 270K. In the early Bassmaster, they are 100K. What that does, that actually makes, by them being lower in value, you actually lose a little bit of gain, and your channels are more interactive, meaning when you turn this volume control, even if you're playing through this channel, the position of this control on its sweep will affect how much signal is going through to ground through that volume control. So that's why you have interactive tone controls, interactive volume controls on the early Marshalls and on the early Bassmans, as well as on the early Traynors. Obviously, someone looking for a more Marshall-like sound need only change these, change that to an 02, and you're pretty much game on at that point for having an early JTM 45 type amplifier. So not many people are aware of how close they are and how great these things sound. Being based on the Tweed Bassman, which is widely heralded as the #1 guitar amp of all time, it doesn't take much to get a great tone out of one of these early Bassmasters. This particular amp is probably my all-time favorite Marshall I've ever played. I've played probably hundreds of them, and original Bassmans, all sorts of Traynor amplifiers. This one is the best sounding Marshall I've ever heard. When I first got it, it was so astonishingly aggressive sounding that I thought for sure I was going to open it up and find some early circuit that was not well publicized, that had some magic going on, and was really shocked to open it up and find that it was in fact a really, really boring, dull, dead stock early plain Jane early PA head. What's interesting about this amp is it actually follows, once again referring to our Tweed Bassman layout and schematic, it follows this schematic very, very closely. Some interesting things to point out, because it is a bass amp, a PA amp. It's closest circuit that Marshall released to the early Bassman. You have the same shared biasing setup for the first preamp tube as the bass amp, the same type of coupling caps you see in the Bassman. This is one notable difference. Since this amp is a 69, the channel splitter resistors are 470K, giving you a little more separation, less interactivity on the volume controls. Because this is a PA amplifier, there is no typical bright cap, which was the big modification that Marshall made to the early Fender circuit. There is no bright cap here over the bright channel, and in fact there is no bright capacitor on the volume control. So the frequency response of the amp is extremely flat in terms of any kind of treble boost. Even though this amp is a 69, it bears a lot more resemblance to an early Plexi than other typical 69 amps. It's a very strange amp. You have the typical Fender values for the tone stack, 250 puff, 56K, pair of O2s going to the tone controls. You only saw these caps for a brief period in 1969. I think they're made by Cornell Dublier. And typical Bassman JTM 45 values across the board here. 27K feedback resistor, everything pretty much the same as the Fender type schematic. What is different about this amp, of course, is that it does use EL34s compared to a Fender, and it does have a solid state rectifier versus a tube rectifier, so it's a little faster response. Even though this amp is a 69, it's interesting because it has the earlier 60s style filtering. A little less filtering tends to make the amp sound a little rawer, and this amp is pretty darn raw. This is that early mid 69 PA amp. That's the volume off.